When I saw my daughter walk into the kitchen earlier than expected, her keys jingling, I froze. The tray I held nearly slipped from my hands. She wasn't supposed to be home yet, not for another 2 hours. My heart pounded so loudly I thought she could hear it from the doorway. I glanced toward the oven, where a second dish was warming, meant only for him. I thought I had time to clear everything, every trace, every clue. But there she stood, her eyes drifting across the room, pausing on the extra set of utensils, the half-drunk glass of wine, and the faint smell of cologne that wasn't hers. Or mine. She didn't say a word. She just looked. And that silence was louder than any accusation. My breath caught in my throat as she slowly turned her head, eyes landing on me like she'd never really seen me before. Her gaze held something terrifying, confusion, betrayal, and the beginning of understanding. That was the moment I knew it was all over. Not because she had proof, but because daughters always know. And in that moment, she did. My fingers gripped the edge of the counter to keep from swaying, and the air in the room turned thick, like walking through syrup. If only I could go back 3 months and undo what I had done. But I couldn't. So instead, let me tell you how it happened. Let me take you back to the first moment I realized I had stepped into something dangerous. But before I share the secret I've kept buried all this time, comment below and tell me, have you ever crossed a line you thought you'd never even approach? It began with soup. Not the fancy kind. Just an ordinary, rainy day sort of soup, potatoes, leeks, and a bit too much pepper. I remember standing in my kitchen that Thursday afternoon, stirring the pot absent-mindedly as the raindrops tapped a gentle rhythm against the window. My daughter had asked me to cook something comforting for dinner. She was bringing someone over. He's different, she'd said on the phone. You'll like him. I had smiled. Of course I would. I always tried to. But the truth was, I hadn't felt genuinely warm toward anyone new in years. When they arrived, I wiped my hands on the dish towel and turned to greet them. He walked in first, tall, confident, with that subtle awkwardness of someone trying to make a good impression. His eyes found mine, and in that split second, something shifted. A glance that lingered a beat too long. A flicker of curiosity. I told myself I imagined it. He extended his hand. It smells incredible in here. My daughter rolled her eyes. She always goes overboard. Wait until you try her risotto. Dinner was fine. The kind of evening where everything looks picture perfect, but inside you feel like a cardboard cutout. I played the role. Smiling. Asking polite questions. Laughing when appropriate. But I wasn't really there. I hadn't truly felt present in months, maybe years. Ever since my husband left, life had gone quiet. Not just the house, but inside me. Like someone turned the volume knob all the way down. After dinner, my daughter took a call and went upstairs. He stayed behind to help me with the dishes. I protested, but he insisted. He dried while I washed, and we fell into that rhythm that's easy to fall into when you're trying not to say what you're really thinking. He reached past me to grab a glass from the drying rack, and his arm brushed mine. Just barely. I stepped back, unsure why my breath caught. I can see where she gets her strength, he said, almost casually. I glanced at him. Excuse me? He gave me a half-smile. Your daughter. She's sharp, grounded. That kind of thing doesn't come from nowhere. It was a kind compliment. Innocent. Probably nothing more. But something in the way he said it. I don't know. It felt personal. Not flirtatious, just aware. And that awareness was enough to make my pulse stutter. The next few days passed in a blur of ordinary things, laundry, grocery lists, a trip to the pharmacy for my knee. But something lingered. A tension I couldn't name. When she mentioned he wanted to learn how to cook real food, and could I show him a few basics, I almost said no. It would have been the sensible thing. But instead, I heard myself say, of course. And so the first lesson happened the following week. He showed up 10 minutes early, with a bouquet of mismatched grocery store flowers and a hopeful smile. "Peace offering," he said. "In case I burn your kitchen down." I laughed more than I should have. Took the flowers, placed them in an old vase, and set them on the counter. We made pasta from scratch. It was messy and chaotic and strangely exhilarating. Flour on his cheeks. Sauce on my apron. He made bad jokes, and I groaned at them. But I was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. At one point, I reached across him to grab the olive oil, and he looked up. Our faces were close. Too close. My hand froze mid-air. He didn't move away. Neither did I. But the moment passed. We went back to boiling noodles and debating whether basil should be torn or chopped. When he left that night, I stood at the door a little too long after it closed, listening to his footsteps fade into the quiet. I told myself it was nothing. Just a silly crush, a fleeting blip on the radar of a lonely woman's life. But when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me when I laughed. The way he listened, not the surface-level nods people give out of politeness, but the kind that makes you feel seen. Really seen. That night, I sat at the edge of my bed, brushing my hair out slowly, and whispered something I hadn't said in years. I feel alive. The words hung in the room, soft and absurd and frightening. I thought about my daughter, asleep down the hall. Her trust. Her pride in me. How she once told me I was her anchor. And yet, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like an anchor at all. I felt like a sail finally catching wind. The next time he came over, I told myself it was just another cooking lesson. Nothing more. The weather was warm, and I had opened the windows to let in the early summer breeze. The smell of basil and garlic filled the kitchen, and the sounds of birds chirping outside somehow made the silence between us louder. I had tied my apron tighter than usual, as if it could somehow hold me together. I told myself to focus on the task at hand, chopping, stirring, teaching. But the way he moved in the kitchen, the way his eyes followed mine, made it impossible to pretend nothing had changed. He asked questions, not just about the recipe, but about me. Where I learned to cook, whether I'd always loved it, what dishes reminded me of my childhood. He listened with a kind of attentiveness that made me feel like my words mattered, as if my stories weren't just filler but something worth remembering. I caught myself watching the way he rolled up his sleeves, the concentration in his face when he minced the herbs, the casual way he leaned against the counter like he belonged there. And for a fleeting moment, I wished he did. I moved around him, brushing past to grab utensils, and each time our arms or shoulders met, I felt a tiny spark, like static. I knew I should have kept more distance, kept it professional. But something in the air felt magnetic. He cracked a joke about his knife skills, or lack thereof, and I laughed without meaning to. That laugh turned into another, and suddenly the room was lighter. When he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, I didn't stop him. It was a small gesture, a quick one, but it lingered in my skin long after. We plated the food and sat at the table. The meal wasn't perfect, his pasta was slightly undercooked, and the sauce too thick, but it didn't matter. We talked. About music, travel, books. Not once did he mention my daughter. And not once did I bring her up. There was something terrifying in how natural it felt, how easy the rhythm between us became. I had lived for years in carefully measured spaces, always accounting for others, always managing expectations. But here, with him, I wasn't managing anything. I was just being. After we ate, he stood and helped clear the table. The moment was so domestic, so familiar, that my throat tightened. I turned away quickly, pretending to look for a dishcloth. He stepped closer, not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him behind me. I heard his voice, low and careful. "You don't have to say anything." I gripped the edge of the counter, unsure whether to move or stay frozen in place. My pulse thundered in my ears. And then, we kissed, It was gentle, almost tentative. The kind of kiss that asks a question rather than makes a statement. My heart raced as if I'd done something unthinkable, and maybe I had. But in that moment, the only thing I felt was alive. When it ended, we both took a step back. He didn't speak, and neither did I. He picked up his jacket, glanced at me once more, then left quietly. I stood there long after the door closed, my fingers touching my lips, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Guilt gnawed at the edge of my thoughts, but it wasn't loud yet, just a murmur. Later that night, I sat on the balcony alone, wrapped in a blanket though the air was warm. My phone buzzed once, a message from him. Just 4 words, "Are you okay now?" I didn't reply. I turned the phone face down and stared into the dark. The next morning, everything looked the same. The kitchen was clean, the dishes put away, the flowers still fresh on the windowsill. But I was different. I moved through the day in slow motion, distracted, uneasy. I forgot to pay a bill, burned my toast, left the laundry in the machine too long. Every small mistake felt enormous. When my daughter came home from class, she was cheerful, oblivious. She dropped her bag and hugged me, thanked me for the leftovers I had packed for her lunch. I smiled and nodded and said something about needing to go to the store. Inside, I felt hollow. That night, I took out an old journal I hadn't touched in years. I flipped to a blank page and stared at it for a long time before writing anything. Eventually, I wrote one sentence. "I don't know who I'm becoming." I stared at the words, trying to recognize the woman behind them. Was she selfish? Desperate? Or just someone who wanted to feel loved again? I didn't have an answer. And I knew this was only the beginning. The next few days unfolded like pages from a book I wasn't ready to read. I tried to convince myself that everything could go back to normal, that what had happened in the kitchen was a single, regrettable moment. But nothing inside me believed that. Not really. Every time I passed by the counter where we had kissed, my fingertips itched as if they still remembered his touch. Every time I opened the fridge, I thought about the wine we hadn't finished, the glasses still drying by the sink, the silence between us when he left. I kept busy to drown out the noise in my head. I rearranged spice jars, scrubbed the floor, alphabetized the pantry. Anything to keep my hands moving and my thoughts from catching up. But even then, I'd find myself staring out the window longer than necessary, half expecting to see him walking up the driveway again. He didn't come. Not for 3 days. When he finally did, it wasn't planned. I was out walking, trying to clear my head with fresh air and motion. The sun was bright but not warm, and the breeze carried that uncertain scent of early summer, part flowers, part dust. I turned the corner of our street and saw him sitting on the bench near the little park where the neighborhood kids used to play. He was looking down at his phone, thumb scrolling slowly. I almost turned around. My legs actually paused mid-step. But he looked up before I could move. There was no avoiding it then. I walked toward him, slowly, cautiously, as if approaching something fragile. He didn't say anything at first. Just shifted to make room. I sat down beside him, careful to leave space between us, even if it felt unnatural. The silence stretched long enough to make me think we wouldn't speak at all. But finally, he said, I wasn't sure I should text again. I nodded, my eyes on the trees. I didn't know how to answer. Another pause. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced. It meant something to me. Those words landed like stones in my stomach. Heavy. Real. I didn't know what to say, so I told the truth. It meant something to me too. That's the problem. He looked at me then, and there was nothing playful or uncertain in his face. Just a kind of raw honesty I hadn't seen before. I don't want to make your life harder, he said. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Neither do I. But we have to be careful. This isn't simple. He nodded. I know. But some things are worth the risk. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The weight of those words pressed too heavily on my chest. After a moment, I stood. I should go. He stood too. Will I see you again? The question hung between us, delicate and dangerous. I don't know, I said honestly. I walked away without looking back, but I could feel his eyes on me until I turned the corner. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying the conversation in my head, the expression on his face, the steadiness in his voice. I had told myself I was in control, that I was strong enough to set boundaries. But it didn't feel like control anymore. It felt like drowning in slow motion. The following day, my daughter mentioned she'd be out late, group project or something. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, heart racing beneath the surface. I told myself not to do anything. Not to reach out. Not to cross that line again. But I did. Not with a message. Not with a call. With a pie. I baked it without thinking. Apple and cinnamon, the kind he said reminded him of childhood. I told myself it was just baking therapy, something to keep my hands busy. But when it came out of the oven, golden and perfect, I wrapped it in foil and walked out the door without hesitation. I didn't knock when I arrived. I just stood there, pie in hand, staring at his door. He opened it before I could gather the courage to knock. Maybe he had heard my footsteps. We stood like that for a moment, both surprised, both afraid. I made too much, I said. He took the pie without a word and stepped aside to let me in. We didn't cook that night. We didn't kiss. We just talked. He told me about his mother, how she used to hum when she cooked, and how he hadn't realized until now how much he missed that sound. I told him about the early days of my marriage, before the silences, before the distance. How I used to dance while stirring sauce, barefoot on the tile floor. We shared stories like they were currency, each one buying back a little piece of ourselves we had lost somewhere along the way. When I left, it was with a clear mind and a heavier heart. I had crossed a line, yes. But I had also found something I didn't know I was still looking for. Connection. Not fantasy. Not lust. Something real. And that, somehow, was even more dangerous. The next morning began like any other, but nothing felt ordinary. I stood in the kitchen holding my mug of coffee, staring at the steam as if it held answers. My hands were steady, but my thoughts swirled like a storm. The air around me felt charged, like a room after a heated conversation. I had walked out of his apartment the night before with my head held high, but inside I had carried something unspoken, something that wouldn't let me rest. I tried to convince myself that the pie was an act of kindness. That talking wasn't crossing a line. That sitting in his kitchen, sharing pieces of our pasts, didn't mean we were slipping further down the path I feared. But I knew better. I wasn't naive. I had been a wife, a mother, a woman long enough to recognize the shift in the air when something was changing. That day, my daughter invited both of us to a casual dinner, just the three of us. She sounded cheerful, excited even, and her happiness made me feel sick with guilt. I had no right to be this tangled in feelings I couldn't explain, not when she was trusting me, not when she was sharing parts of her life that mattered. I wanted to say no. I wanted to create distance. But I didn't. I said yes. So, that evening, I cooked. Nothing elaborate. Just a roasted chicken with herbs and lemon, some vegetables, and a salad she loved. It was simple, grounding. I focused on each step like it was a task and a meditation practice. Washington chop. Season. Stir. Taste. It kept my mind just occupied enough to not unravel. He arrived before she did. I heard the knock at the door and felt a familiar twinge of something I wasn't ready to name. When I opened it, he stood there with a bottle of wine and a tentative smile. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I stepped aside and let him in. In the kitchen, I handed him the corkscrew and turned my attention back to the oven. He moved through the room like he belonged there, and that terrified me. Then she arrived. Full of energy, chatting about her day, about a professor who'd made an inappropriate joke, about a girl in her class who had gotten engaged too young. I nodded, laughed when expected, kept my hands busy. Her joy was infectious, but inside, I was crumbling. We ate together at the small table by the window. The three of us, like a perfectly balanced triangle. She talked the most, filling the silence with stories and ideas. He added comments now and then, stealing glances at me when she wasn't looking. I tried to avoid his eyes, afraid of what they'd say, and more afraid of what I might say back without speaking. After dessert, store-bought cookies she'd picked up on the way home, she excused herself to take a call. Something about a group project. As soon as she disappeared into the other room, the air thickened. I moved to clear the dishes, but he stepped in beside me. Our hands brushed over the stack of plates. His voice was quiet, but insistent. This isn't fair to you. I shook my head. It's not about fair. He looked at me then, and the sincerity in his eyes was unbearable. I think about you all the time. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had closed. We stood in silence, facing each other in the soft glow of the kitchen light. The weight of the moment pressed down on us, making the room feel smaller, the air thinner. I took a deep breath and picked up the tray of empty glasses. Before I could move away, he gently touched my arm. I'm sorry. I met his gaze, and in that moment, I saw the truth in his eyes. He hadn't meant for this to happen either. Later that night, after they both left, I sat alone in the same kitchen. The plates were clean. The wine bottle was nearly empty. The chair he had used was slightly turned toward mine. I poured myself the last inch of wine and drank it in one slow sip. Then I stood, turned out the lights, and climbed the stairs in silence. In bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the house settling. My thoughts were loud. Deafening. I remembered the way his eyes searched mine when she wasn't looking. The quiet apology in his voice. The ache in my chest that hadn't gone away since that first cooking lesson. What was I doing? What kind of woman betrayed her daughter's trust like this? I hated myself for even asking the question. And yet, I couldn't stop asking it. The following morning, I got up early. Too early. I needed air. I needed something else to focus on. So I drove to the farmer's market outside of town. I walked between the stalls in silence, pretending to be someone else. Someone who hadn't complicated her life. Someone who hadn't forgotten the lines that once seemed so clear. I picked up fresh thyme, early peaches, a crusty loaf of bread. I didn't need any of it, but I wanted to feel normal. I wanted to feel like I still had control over something. Back at home, I unpacked slowly. Washed the fruit. Put away the herbs. Set the bread in the wooden basket by the sink. Then I sat down at the table, opened my notebook again, and wrote one sentence. This isn't who I thought I was. I underlined it twice. Outside, the day went on like any other. People walked their dogs. Children rode bikes. The world turned without hesitation. Inside, everything in me was hesitating. And I knew that next time I saw him, there would be no more pretending. Not for me. That weekend, my daughter suggested we spend some time outside the house. Let's go somewhere together, she said, her eyes bright, her tone hopeful. She'd noticed something different in me, I could feel it. Maybe she didn't understand it yet, but she sensed the undercurrent, the way children intuit things their parents try to hide. I agreed, of course. I had to. I couldn't afford to draw more suspicion. We drove out to a nearby botanical garden. The weather was warm, the kind that makes you believe everything is softer than it really is. We walked among blooming peonies and magnolias, our conversation light, unburdened. I listened to her speak about her plans, her classes, her ambitions. But part of me wasn't there. Part of me kept drifting back to him, wondering if he would text, wondering if I even wanted him to. When we returned that evening, the sun already low behind the rooftops, I found a message from him waiting. Simple. Can I see you? I stared at it for a long time before replying. I didn't want to say yes. I didn't want to make this worse. But I also couldn't bring myself to say no. So instead, I wrote, come by tomorrow, when she's at class. The next morning, I cleaned the kitchen as if it were being prepared for inspection. I set out fresh herbs, eggs, flour, ingredients for a dish we'd never quite finished learning together. It gave me something to do, a disguise for the real reason I had invited him. He arrived on time. Not early, not late. When I opened the door, he stepped inside like he had before, and yet something in the air was different. There was no small talk. No jokes. Just quiet acknowledgement. We cooked. Or at least, we pretended to. I guided him through the recipe mechanically, pointing out techniques, correcting his knife angle. He followed along, but his attention wasn't on the food, and neither was mine. At one point, he asked me to check the seasoning. I reached across him to stir the pan, and our arms touched. Neither of us moved away. We finished preparing the dish, though neither of us was hungry. We sat at the table, facing each other, 2 plates between us untouched. And then, without a word, we kissed, It was different from the first time. Not hesitant, not questioning. It carried with it all the weight of what had come before and all the danger of what might come next. When we pulled apart, he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His eyes held everything, regret, longing, fear, desire. All tangled together. I stood up, walked to the sink, and began rinsing the pan. My hands moved automatically, like they belonged to someone else. I heard him stand behind me, his breath steady, his presence impossible to ignore. But then, he said quietly, "This can't keep happening." I nodded without turning around. I know. He hesitated before adding, "But I don't want to stop." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing against my ribs like stones. I wanted to scream, to cry, to confess everything and walk away clean. But none of those things happened. Instead, I said, "You should go." And he did. After the door closed, I stayed at the sink, hands submerged in water gone cold. I washed the same spoon over and over until my fingers went numb. That evening, my daughter returned, humming as she entered, carrying takeout bags and asking if I wanted to watch something together. I smiled, nodded, said yes. I sat beside her on the couch, her head resting lightly against my shoulder, the flicker of the television playing across our faces. But I wasn't watching the screen. I was watching the distance between who I was and who I had become. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. Pipes creaking. Wind brushing against the window. The distant hum of a car passing. And somewhere deeper, the echo of a decision I had already made but hadn't yet admitted. I had let something begin that I no longer knew how to end. The next morning, I found myself back in the kitchen, notebook open, pen in hand. I wrote one sentence. I don't know how to be the version of myself she believes I am. And I didn't. But I knew I had to keep trying. The next few days passed like walking on a rope stretched taut above something I refused to look down into. I tried to return to normalcy, but everything felt subtly off. My morning coffee didn't taste the same. The walls of the house seemed to listen more carefully. Even the sunlight through the curtains looked different, sharper, exposing too much. I avoided the kitchen as much as I could. It had become a charged space, no longer a place of comfort or routine. It held memories now. Not just of cooking or family meals, but of moments I couldn't explain away. His presence still lingered, in the folded apron on the hook, in the faint scent of rosemary clinging to the counters, in the silence between tasks. My daughter, thankfully, seemed distracted by her own schedule. She had tests coming up and spent long evenings at the campus library. She would come home tired, drop her bag on the floor, and collapse on the couch with a blanket and her laptop. I offered tea, snacks, anything to keep my hands occupied. She accepted with grateful smiles. I wondered if she saw how tightly I was clinging to every shred of her affection. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the house. It was midweek, and I had the entire place to myself for the first time in days. I wandered through the rooms without purpose, drawn to places I hadn't really looked at in a long time. My daughter's childhood photos on the wall. The dent in the hallway where the suitcase always knocked. The stack of unopened letters on the hall table. Eventually, I ended up back in the kitchen. The sun was pouring in through the window above the sink, making the countertops glow. I stood there, palms flat against the surface, breathing slowly. And then I did something unexpected. I reached for my phone and sent him a message. Not a long one. Just, "Do you still want to cook?" He replied almost immediately. Yes. When? I hesitated, then wrote, now. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the weight of unspoken things pressing against my ribs. Maybe I just didn't want to be alone anymore. He arrived half an hour later. I had already started laying out ingredients. I didn't even know what we were going to make, I just wanted movement, noise, anything to keep me from thinking. When he walked in, there was no need for greeting. We both went straight to the sink, washing our hands side by side like we had done a dozen times before. We worked in rhythm again, like we had before. Chopping, tossing, stirring. I found myself calming into the process, grateful for its clarity. But beneath that calm was something deeper. A hum of energy I couldn't switch off. We talked, though only lightly. About food, about favorite spices, about a recipe we'd both seen online. I asked him how his week had been, and he smiled in that quiet way of his, offering only enough to acknowledge the question. We both knew the real conversations were happening between the words. As the food cooked, we sat across from each other, elbows on the table, the scent of roasted tomatoes and garlic thick in the air. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You feel far away." I looked down at my hands. "I've been trying to be." He nodded. "I know. I can feel it. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, but full. I'm not good at this, I said. I don't know how to navigate something that's never supposed to happen. He leaned forward slightly. Neither do I. But I know I don't want to pretend it didn't. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the steam rising from the pot on the stove, willing it to give me a clear answer. Then I said, every time I look at her, I feel like I'm erasing pieces of who she thinks I am. His expression softened, but he didn't argue. He understood. That was one of the things that made this so much harder. After we ate, barely tasting the food, we stood at the sink again, washing dishes in silence. The ordinary act of cleaning felt heavier than ever before. I watched soap bubbles slide down the plate in my hand, watched them disappear down the drain, and wondered if guilt could be rinsed away just as easily. When he left, he didn't ask if he could come back. I didn't tell him not to. Later that evening, my daughter walked into the kitchen with her backpack slung over one shoulder, pulling out a handful of snacks and notebooks. "Smells like something good happened in here," she said casually, tossing her things on the counter. I smiled without meeting her eyes. "Just experimenting." She leaned against the fridge and looked at me closely. "You've been quiet lately." I shrugged, still not looking at her. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. Only this time, I wasn't wondering what I would do. I already knew. The problem was that knowing and acting were entirely different things. And the longer I waited, the more impossible the distance between them became. The silence in the house had begun to feel like a living thing. It pulsed through the walls, stretched itself out across the floors, settled into the spaces between words. I moved through the days as though I were walking through water, everything slower, heavier, more deliberate. And though nothing had been said out loud, everything had changed. My daughter was still coming and going as usual, but her presence had grown sharper. She observed me more closely, like someone trying to read between the lines of a familiar book suddenly filled with new margins. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. But the quiet curiosity in her eyes told me she was beginning to feel the crack in the foundation. I spent more time outside the house, short walks through town, wandering aisles of stores without buying anything, sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot just to avoid being home. I had stopped writing in my notebook. The last sentence remained untouched. "I don't know how to be the version of myself she believes I am." I couldn't write past it. Not when it still rang true. When his name lit up my phone, I waited. I didn't open the message right away. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would say. And I knew what I would do. That morning, I told my daughter I had errands to run. She barely looked up from her laptop. "Okay," she said. "Will you be back for dinner?" "I'll try," I answered, grabbing my keys and coat. He had sent me the address of a small studio space he had rented for a project. Cooking videos, he'd said. Something new he was experimenting with. It was outside the city, tucked behind an old hardware store and barely marked. When I arrived, the sun had just begun to warm the concrete sidewalk, and the street was nearly empty. I knocked once. He opened the door almost immediately. Inside, the space was simple. A makeshift kitchen had been set up near the back, nothing elaborate, just a counter, a stove, some shelves with spices and utensils. Light filtered in through a high window, and dust floated in the air like a quiet snowfall. Neither of us spoke. I moved toward the counter, running my fingers along the edge. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. There was something different in his expression. Less tension, more certainty. As though he had decided not to fight something anymore. We didn't start cooking. We didn't even pretend to. I turned toward him. He was watching me, not with expectation or desire, but with the kind of quiet intensity that made my breath catch. I took a step closer. Then another. There were no words exchanged. Only that heavy, silent understanding that had been growing between us for weeks. We spent the night together. The details don't matter. What matters is what followed. The room, once filled with a kind of charged anticipation, now held the weight of something real. Something irreversible. I sat at the edge of the small couch near the back wall, pulling my sweater around my shoulders. He was across from me, arms resting on his knees, gaze fixed on the floor. I wanted to feel peace. Or at least clarity. But all I felt was the slow, creeping realization that nothing would be the same again. After a while, he spoke. "What happens now?" I shook my head. "I don't know." He looked at me then, searching my face for something I couldn't give him. "We crossed a line," I said quietly. "And I don't think we can go back." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached for my hand and held it gently. No pressure. Just presence. When I left the studio, the sky had darkened. Evening shadows stretched long across the pavement, and the air had turned cool. I drove home with the windows down, the wind loud in my ears. My thoughts were a tangle I couldn't begin to sort. Pulling into the driveway, I saw the living room light still on. Her shadow moved behind the curtains, a soft silhouette framed by the glow of the lamp. I sat in the car for several minutes, watching the movement of her figure, trying to summon the strength to go inside. When I finally did, she was in the kitchen, spooning leftover soup into a bowl. She looked up, offered a small smile. "You didn't miss much. Just a quiet evening." I nodded, hanging up my coat. As I moved past her, she paused. "You smell like garlic." I froze for a fraction of a second. I stopped by the studio. He was testing a recipe. I helped a little. She didn't say anything right away. Just stirred her soup, then said, "I figured." I waited. But that was all she gave me. I went upstairs, heart pounding, limbs heavy. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, replaying her words again and again. I figured. It was subtle. Not a confrontation. Not an accusation. But it was something. That night, I didn't sleep. And when the sun came up, casting pale light across my bedroom wall, I understood something with painful clarity. Whatever this had been, whatever it was becoming, was no longer just mine to carry. The morning after felt colder than it should have. The house was quiet, but not in its usual way. It was the kind of quiet that waits, that listens, that knows something has changed and is simply biding its time. I moved through my routine with mechanical precision, coffee, toast, the slow opening of curtains, but every motion was accompanied by a dull ache behind my ribs. Downstairs, my daughter was already dressed, sipping tea at the table. She looked up as I entered, her eyes unreadable. I smiled and greeted her, careful to keep my voice light. She responded in kind, but there was a pause between our sentences that hadn't been there before. The spaces between words had grown wider, heavier. She mentioned a meeting with her study group, grabbed her bag, and left without lingering. I watched her from the window as she walked down the street, her steps purposeful, her head held high. I envied her certainty. I envied her clarity. After she left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, the steam from my mug rising and vanishing into the air. I thought about calling him, but my fingers refused to move. I thought about writing in my notebook, but the pages felt too thin to hold what I needed to say. So instead, I cleaned. The kind of deep, relentless cleaning that has nothing to do with dust and everything to do with control. I scrubbed the counters, reorganized the spice rack, emptied drawers I hadn't touched in months. I moved from room to room like a shadow, trying to erase myself from the places I'd been. But the memory of what had happened, what I had allowed to happen, clung to everything like smoke. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the muted television, not watching, not listening. My phone buzzed beside me. His name appeared on the screen. I didn't open the message right away. I just held the phone in my hand, feeling its weight. Eventually, I swiped it open. "Are you okay?" I stared at the words, then typed, "She knows." 3 seconds. That's how long it took for the typing indicator to appear. What did she say? She didn't have to. He didn't respond after that, and I was strangely grateful. There was nothing left to say through a screen. The next words, if there were any, would have to be spoken aloud. Later that evening, as I stood at the stove reheating soup, I heard the front door open. My daughter walked in, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if the day had been too long. She dropped her bag beside the door, then paused. "I ran into him," she said without turning around. I froze. My hand tightened around the ladle, though I wasn't stirring anything. She walked into the kitchen slowly, leaning against the counter across from me. "He seemed off," she continued. "Not like usual." I kept my eyes on the pot. "Maybe he had a hard day." She tilted her head. "Maybe." The silence stretched again, filling the room like rising water. I waited for her to say something more, to press further. But instead, she turned and opened the fridge. I exhaled slowly, unsure whether I was relieved or disappointed. We ate dinner in near silence. She picked at her food, pushing pieces of bread around her plate. I tried to make conversation, asked about her classes, her professors, her plans for the weekend, but her answers were short, distracted. Her smile never reached her eyes. After dinner, she disappeared into her room, and I cleaned the kitchen alone. The clink of dishes in the sink sounded too loud in the quiet. I took longer than necessary to dry each glass, stacking them carefully, as though the neatness could fix what was unraveling beneath the surface. When the house was still, I sat down in the living room, lights dimmed, and stared at the photograph on the mantel. It was from years ago, her birthday party, the three of us smiling in the backyard, sunlight caught in our hair. I had my arm around her shoulders. She was leaning into me, laughing. I remembered the exact moment the picture was taken. I remembered feeling content. I wondered if she remembered it the same way. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke with a start, the room dark now, the only light coming from the hallway. I stood slowly, stretching stiff limbs, and climbed the stairs. Outside her door, I paused. I thought about knocking. About sitting on the edge of her bed and telling her everything, the truth, the regret, the reasons that would never be enough. I imagined her face as I spoke, the flicker of hurt, the disbelief, the quiet collapse of trust. But I didn't knock. I went to bed and lay awake, the sheets cold around me, the silence inside louder than ever. And somewhere in the dark, I realized that what terrified me most wasn't that she might confront me. It was that she wouldn't. That she would retreat into a place I could no longer reach. That the distance I had created might become permanent. That I was no longer someone she could come home to. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar kind of stillness, not peace, but the hush that precedes a storm. My daughter and I moved through the house like polite strangers, careful not to disturb whatever fragile truce held us in place. The rhythm of our lives continued, but without melody. Meals were quieter, shorter. Conversations became limited to logistical necessities, groceries, appointments, schedules. Nothing personal. Nothing real. She didn't ask questions. And I didn't offer answers. But the silence between us had grown teeth. Every time our eyes met across a room, I felt them. Sharp and unrelenting. It was no longer a question of if she knew, but how much, and how deeply it had already cut into her. I kept myself busy in small ways. Reorganizing drawers, repainting chipped corners of cabinets, tending to the garden in the early hours before the sun became unbearable. I avoided mirrors. Avoided the kitchen when I knew she would be there. Avoided the scent of rosemary and garlic, which now triggered something far too heavy in my chest. One afternoon, while she was out, I opened my notebook again. The pages felt brittle beneath my fingertips, like something preserved too long. I flipped past the last entry, found a clean sheet, and wrote, "This house is full of echoes. And I don't know how to be silent anymore." I didn't expect him to come by. After our last time together, I had told myself that chapter was closed. Not because it felt finished, but because it had to be. Because continuing meant breaking something too sacred. And I had already cracked the surface. But that morning, he messaged. Just 3 words, "Can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. I stood by the sink, watching the condensation on the window blur the outside world. My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I typed, "Come by after 5. She's working late." When the clock hit 5:30, he knocked once and stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. I suppose he understood there was no point in ceremony anymore. I motioned toward the living room and sat down, my hands folded tightly in my lap. He didn't sit. He stood near the window, fingers grazing the curtain edge, eyes searching the space like it had changed somehow. Maybe it had. "I keep thinking about it," he said. I nodded, though he wasn't looking at me. "I know." There was a long pause. "She looks at me differently," he said finally. Not accusing. Just distant. I swallowed hard. "She's doing the same with me." He turned to face me. "Then maybe she doesn't know everything." "Or maybe she knows enough," I replied. "And that's worse." He stepped forward, slowly. "Do you regret it?" I hesitated. That's a complicated question. I don't want a simple answer. I looked up at him. His face, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. A person who had become both a comfort and a weight. "I regret the pain it's causing. But I don't regret feeling alive." He exhaled through his nose, a half sigh, half laugh. "That's exactly how I feel." Another silence. The kind that tastes like finality. "I think we have to stop," I said. He nodded. "I know. But not just stop," I continued. "We have to step back. Completely. No more visits. No more messages. Not even glances when we're all in the same room." His jaw tightened. "Can you do that?" I closed my eyes for a moment. "I have to." He sat then, finally, across from me. "I never meant to complicate your life." "I know," I whispered. "Neither did I." We sat like that for a while. 2 people who had lost their way, trying to find their footing in the aftermath. When he left, it was quiet, clean. No lingering. No promises. Just the soft click of the door behind him. That evening, I made pasta. From scratch. It was something I hadn't done in weeks. I needed the repetition, the grounding. The way flour clung to my palms. The scent of olive oil warming in the pan. I wasn't making it for her or for him. I was making it for myself. When she came home, she hovered in the doorway, surprised. "You cooked?" she asked. I nodded, not looking up. "Just something simple." She stepped inside, slowly. It smells like old times. I forced a smile. Maybe that's what I need right now. She sat down at the table and watched me work. For the first time in days, the silence didn't feel as hostile. It was still there, still tense. But it wasn't suffocating. We ate together, carefully. Each of us aware of the unspoken things swirling just beneath the surface. But we were in the same room, breathing the same air. That counted for something. After dinner, she helped with the dishes. It wasn't effortless like it used to be. But it was something. As she dried a plate, she said, "He hasn't been around lately." I paused before responding. No. Is that, on purpose? I met her gaze. Yes. She didn't nod. Didn't smile. Just looked at me for a long time before placing the plate on the rack. Okay, she said quietly. That night, I wrote again in my notebook. We are learning how to be in the same room again. I don't know how long it will take. But I'm still here. And so is she. It wasn't redemption. But maybe it was the start of something else. Something harder, slower, but possibly real. The finality of my decision didn't come with a dramatic scene or some cinematic shift in the air. It arrived slowly, like a season changing, quiet, undeniable, and deeply rooted. After he left that last time, something within me settled. Not peacefully, not without sorrow, but with a kind of resignation that allowed for breath. The following days were still, but not stagnant. My daughter and I found new ways to occupy the same spaces again. The tension remained, faint but present, like the smell of smoke long after a fire has been put out. Yet there were small signs that something was rebuilding between us. A shared grocery list. A folded sweater left on my bed. A cup of tea placed silently at my side while I read. I no longer checked my phone for his name. I no longer avoided the kitchen or the bench outside the cafe where we had once sat, laughing over burnt pastries and stories that didn't belong to us. I had placed those moments in a separate room of my memory, one I did not visit often, but hadn't locked entirely. I started writing more regularly again. Not in search of absolution, but to understand. To name the things I had buried beneath shame and longing. My notebook became a witness, never judging, never correcting, simply holding what I was finally ready to look at. One Sunday afternoon, I baked a lemon cake. Not for any reason. Not for a guest. Not for an apology. Just because I used to love the way the citrus filled the house with brightness. The oven warmed the kitchen as soft light pooled across the tile floor. The scent was familiar, comforting, something that belonged solely to me. She came downstairs mid-bake, her hair tied loosely, a book tucked under her arm. "You're baking," she said, surprised but not questioning. I nodded. Just felt like it. She watched for a moment, then moved to the other side of the kitchen and began making tea. We worked in silence, moving around one another with a familiarity that felt almost natural again. There was no tension in her shoulders, no guarded looks. Only space. Real, lived-in space. I cut 2 slices and placed them on a plate, then carried it to the table. She brought the tea. We sat facing one another, the windows open to a breeze that made the curtains sway gently behind her. The cake was good. Simple. A little too dense, maybe, but that didn't matter. After a few bites, she looked at me, not with suspicion, not with accusation, but with a kind of searching I had seen before, in myself. "I missed this," she said. I swallowed. "Me too." There was a long pause. "I'm not asking you to explain anything," she continued. "I don't think I want to know the details. But I need to understand where we are now." Her words were steady. She wasn't asking for a confession. She was offering me a chance. I met her gaze. I'm trying to be someone you can trust again. Not by erasing what happened. Just by being here. Choosing this. She nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Okay. That was all. That was enough. That evening, as I washed dishes, I caught a glimpse of us in the window reflection, two figures moving side by side, not perfectly aligned, but parallel. There was comfort in that image. Not perfection. But presence. Later, in my room, I opened the notebook and wrote. This isn't about redemption. It's about responsibility. About showing up. About learning that love, real love, isn't always clean or deserved or even comfortable. Sometimes it's choosing to stay, to rebuild, to speak when it's easier to be silent. I didn't write his name again. Not once. Not because he didn't matter. But because his chapter had ended. And I had chosen to close the book. One night, as I was folding laundry, my daughter appeared in the doorway holding a photo frame. It was the picture from her birthday years ago, the one I had stared at so many times. I want to hang this in the hallway again, she said. I nodded. It's a good memory. She looked at it for a long moment, then smiled. It still is. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving the photo resting against the wall. I stood there for a while, hands still in the fabric, the scent of clean linen rising to meet me. Maybe forgiveness wasn't always about words. Maybe it was about finding your way back to ordinary moments, together. And maybe this quiet, unspoken understanding, was the closest thing to healing we would ever need.